Welcome to the Level 2 training module for Core Requirement 7, Data Security, which explains the fundamentals of this section in greater detail. While the intention of this training module is to increase understanding of R2 requirements, it is not intended to be used as a standalone guide. For the official text of all R2 requirements, download the R2 v3 standard from the CERI website. Theft of data and other data breaches pose a serious threat to businesses, governments, and consumers worldwide. That's why securing and properly sanitizing data is the number one concern for most suppliers and users of recycling or ITAD services when choosing a third-party vendor to manage their used electronics. Core Requirement 7 covers the process for securing data and data-containing equipment. It's important to understand that this is not a one-size-fits-all process. Three factors will dictate the methods necessary to manage data devices: the type of equipment, supplier requirements, and legal requirements. There are two general principles in Core 7. The first is to provide for the security and sanitization of all data storage devices as appropriate to the type of device and level of sensitivity of the data. The requirements for this general principle focus on documenting and defining how the facility will secure and sanitize data. The second general principle is to employ security measures appropriate for the electronic equipment it handles and the suppliers it serves. The requirements for this general principle focus on implementing and maintaining the procedures and controls for securing and sanitizing data. Let's take a closer look at the requirements that support each general principle. Core 7 requires that facilities develop two different documents to serve as the framework for planning and implementing the appropriate security controls and data sanitization processes. The first is a written data sanitization plan, and the second is a written data security policy. The requirements for developing the data sanitization plan are very specific and provide a comprehensive framework for the entire data sanitization process, regardless of whether sanitization is done internally by the facility or externally by a downstream vendor. Let's look at the elements that must be included in the data sanitization plan and/or the facility's procedures. First, the plan must define the security controls to protect data, and must declare any secured areas in the facility for data sanitization with controlled access. Some common security controls are badge access, background checks, caged areas, and security cameras. Security controls will often be dependent on supplier requirements. The data sanitization plan must define the types of data storage devices accepted. As technologies advance, it's critical that facilities stay informed of new devices and their potential to contain data. It's important to remember that data storage devices encompass much more than hard drives. SIM cards, flash drives, servers, PC cards, cell phones, and headsets are all examples of items that may have stored data. In addition, the types of data to be sanitized must also be defined. For example, private, confidential, or licensed data. The type of data often dictates the level of sanitization required. For instance, confidential government data may require logical sanitization prior to physical sanitization. The plan must also describe any general information that does not need to be sanitized. For example, licensed open-source operating systems and device firmware, or freeware apps on a smartphone. And potential connections to network services that could automatically repopulate data on devices must also be defined. For instance, cloud services backing up smartphones and user data. The plan should define the limited instances when customers may not want their data sanitized. For instance, when a device is repaired and returned to the customer with the data intact. In such cases, the facility must maintain written contractual agreements not to sanitize data on user storage devices. It must also identify any applicable legal, supplier, or other requirements for data sanitization, including data breach and privacy regulations, such as with financial, governmental, or medical information. The plan must also identify other policies and procedures required to comply with legal, supplier, and other requirements. This connection ensures the plan is integrated with other key procedures and policies. The data sanitization plan or procedures must describe the sanitization methods the facility uses for each type of data storage device. Methods of sanitization can be logical or physical in nature and include activities such as software wiping, shredding, degaussing, crushing, and incinerating. It must also include the amount of time required to sanitize items, starting from the time of receipt. This duration could be directed by a supplier or internally defined. Prompt sanitization thus reduces the risk of mishandling of a data device and data breaches. If the R2 facility does not perform all data sanitization internally, the plan or procedures must identify the downstream vendors or contractors that will perform all data sanitization services. The plan must also identify the specific records the facility will use to demonstrate effectiveness of the sanitization and verification process. For example, traceability records for devices, technician training records, sanitization equipment maintenance records, camera system recordings, physical sanitization records, software logical sanitization records, or monitoring and testing records of the security controls. And finally, the data sanitization plan requires a process for authorizing and monitoring everyone permitted to have access to equipment and components containing data. This includes workers, visitors, and others. This process could include a requirement for background checks, drug testing, special training, badge access, and other criteria that enables a person to have contact with data storage devices. In addition to the data security plan we just reviewed, Core 7 requires one other key document, the Data Security Policy. Let's take a closer look. The Data Security Policy defines the R2 facility's intentions and commitments for ensuring data security as an organization. Core 7A2 has some specific mandatory content that must be included in the policy. First, the policy must prohibit unauthorized individuals from handling or accessing equipment containing data. It must also assign a competent data protection representative who will be responsible for the facility's data security and legal compliance. The data protection representative will also have oversight of all duties described in the data security plan and procedures. It must mandate reporting of all known and suspected data or security breaches to the data protection representative. The policy must also require training and confidentiality agreements before anyone can be authorized to handle any equipment containing data. And lastly, the policy must identify the penalties for noncompliance with the policy, including personal liability. Core 7A3 requires that workers are regularly trained on the facility's policies and procedures for data security to the degree appropriate for their authorization levels. For example, general authorization levels for workers in common areas, as compared to increased authorization levels for workers performing sanitization activities in secure areas. Verification of competence must also be conducted to qualify a person's skills in relationship to meeting the data sanitization and data security requirements. So, we just finished looking at requirements that support the first general principle in Core 7, which focuses on documenting and defining. Next, let's take a closer look at the second general principle, to employ security measures appropriate for the electronic equipment it handles and the suppliers it serves. This general principle is supported by the requirements in 7b and Section 7c. Let's take a closer look at both sections, beginning with 7b. 7b requires that facilities implement and maintain a security program that controls access to all or part of the facility. There are several important factors when determining the level of access control. The types of equipment being handled, the sensitivity of data as defined in the data sanitization plan, the needs of the suppliers, and risk of theft and unauthorized access to the facility and equipment. Some access controls may include gates, keypads, locked rooms, or fenced-off areas. Any specific secured area that requires authorized access must be clearly identified with signage to warn against unauthorized access. Facilities must also implement levels of security authorizations based on the same criteria used in the data sanitization plan: the types of equipment being handled, the sensitivity of the data, the needs of suppliers, and any applicable legal or other requirements. The facility's assigned data protection representative is responsible for granting authorizations. All individuals granted a security authorization must sign an acknowledgement of their responsibility to prevent disclosure of data, report any theft of data or data breaches, and to disclose any incidents that may change an individual's security authorization level. The R2 facility must maintain signed acknowledgments from all individuals who have been granted a security authorization. To ensure the effectiveness of the security program and security authorization process, the R2 facility must implement controls to monitor established security processes. Monitoring may include activities such as security audits, review of bag access logs, or review of closed circuit cameras. The last item in the 7B security section is the incident response procedure, which provides a mechanism to investigate and report failures in security controls which result in data breaches. Now that we've covered the security controls in 7B, let's take a closer look at the process section in 7C. The requirements in 7C begin with providing the supplier confirmation that equipment or components containing data have been received, the method that will be used to sanitize the data, and whether the sanitization will be completed internally by the R2 facility or by a downstream vendor. If the processing is being conducted internally, it must follow one of two paths: logical and/or physical sanitization for those facilities certified to the additional Appendix B requirements for data sanitization, or physical destruction of the data devices in accordance with the NIST 800-88 guidelines. If physical destruction is chosen as the processing path, the R2 facility must verify 100% effectiveness of the destruction. If the processing is being carried out externally by a downstream vendor, the R2 facility must first have a signed contract for data sanitization services. Additionally, the downstream vendor must be verified in accordance with Appendix A, Downstream Recycling Chain. Finally, the R2 facility must conduct internal data security and data sanitization audits at least annually. These audits must validate that the security controls and data sanitization operational controls have been effectively maintained. Process validation activities may include verification of training records, equipment preventive maintenance records, quality control activities and records, sampling records, verification of software controls, access controls, or authorization records. These audits must be completed by an independent auditor who understands the data sanitization controls and is able to determine conformance. The final component of Core 7 is found in 7D, Notifications. Facilities must have a process to notify suppliers, where requested, of changes in downstream vendors that process the supplier's data containing equipment or components, or breaches in security. Core 7, Data Security, is an integral component of R2v3 and reflects the ever-growing urgency to protect data and mitigate the risk of data breaches. It is imperative that R2 facilities maintain rigor in knowing whether the devices they receive contain data. This knowledge provides the inputs for the data sanitization plan, the data security policy, and the security program that are critical to ensuring that data devices are secured and processed under controlled conditions. For more information about the R2v3 standard, visit the R2 Knowledge Base on the SERI website.